Hey everyone, welcome to session 109 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I'm joined by multiple-time guest, Dr. Pat McGreevy today. We talk about what he's been up to lately, how he supports learners who have barriers in communication, his experience implementing Essential for Living in public school settings, and related to that, why he prefers working with non-behavior analysts. And we end with a fun and poignant story about Pat's mentor, Ogden Lindsley. We also spend some time discussing the upcoming Verbal Behavior Conference. It's taking place on April 2nd and 3rd in Austin, Texas. And I should note that in the spirit of transparency, I'm helping the Central Texas Autism Center promote the event, so keep that in mind for what it's worth. In addition to promoting the event, I'm also excited to be a part of the program this year. And I have to really thank Kelly Rich for inviting me to, again, be a part of this. I'm really excited. At the end of the first day, I get to moderate a panel with all the conference speakers. So if this sounds like fun to you, head to ctac1.com/podcast and take advantage of the discount that was arranged for Behavioral Observations listeners. Again, that's ctac1.com/podcast, or just go to the show notes of this episode. Also, if you're traveling to Austin, the special event rates for the conference hotel, the Hilton Austin, will expire on March 2nd. So if this is something you're considering, I would advise that you make your plans soon. If you can't make it to the event but want to learn more about Pat and or the Essential for Living assessment and curriculum, check out their website. They've wisely shortened the URL so it's easy to remember. So go to eflapp.com or simply eflap with 2 P's.com and check out their options for online training at eflap.com/training. That's eflapp.com/training. And lastly, this podcast is sponsored by an event that's coming up in a different part of the country. It's called The Insider's Guide to Legal Tactics Used Against Schools, How Behavior Analysis Can Help. This event is brought to you by Brett Denovi & Associates, and it takes place on February 28th, 2020 at the Doubletree Hilton Hotel at SeaWorld in Orlando, Florida. If you're not in the Florida area, you can attend via webinar. Student discounts are available, and all proceeds go towards supporting the B.F. Skinner Foundation. Again, I would hit the show notes to this episode at behavioralobservations.com to find the specific sign-up details. And I think that is about it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's get right to this fun conversation with Dr. Pat McGreevy.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Pat McGreevy, thanks for joining me for what this must be the fourth time? I don't know, it's getting up there. Thanks for joining me again on today's episode of the Behavioral Observations Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You know, I'm really excited because we're going to actually see each other in a couple short months here at the Verbal Behavior Conference in Austin, Texas. And I thought I'd have you come on and talk about some of the things that you plan on talking about, but anything else that you have on your mind. Your appearances on the show have been some of the most highly downloaded, and the listeners really love what you have to say. So I thought it was just a great excuse to have you back on and to have another enjoyable chat. So again, thanks for taking some time out of your Friday afternoon to talk with me.
Sure.
So I figured the first place I'd start is just to catch up. So what's been going on with you? I think the last time we talked, you had said that you were about to, or you just came back from doing some work in some large school districts. I think it was somewhere in the LA area. Can you? One of the things that I figured we could start with perhaps is in terms of catching up. What is it? I assume you're going in there teaching the Essential for Living. So I'd be curious about some of the work that you've been doing in school districts in particular. So can you talk about that work?
Well, most of my work these days is centered around talking about the teaching of functional life skills and the use of Essential for Living. And we've managed to become a part of school districts on a smaller level, like beginning with one teacher or one department or part of one school, We've also had major school adoptions where an entire department of special education in a school district will adopt us. And then we've had all the way from smaller districts all the way to the largest district in North America. We have been in the New York City public schools, District 75, for, well, it's close to 5 years now, and almost since the beginning. We are also in the Fairfax County School District, which is the northwest suburb of Washington, D.C., and we are in about 6 school districts in metropolitan Dallas, Texas. An example of a smaller school district would be Fort Mill in South Carolina, or Santa Cruz County Office of Education in California, and recently the Albuquerque, New Mexico public schools. So we're beginning to penetrate some school districts, and sometimes smaller ones, and on a few occasions larger ones as well.
Talk to me a little bit about the challenge, and conversely, perhaps whatever the opportunities there might be. Obviously, you can affect more individuals of working in these larger school districts, especially as you said, you're some of the largest ones in the country.
Yeah, obviously you can affect more children, but there's also several layers of bureaucracy and potential entanglements there when you have larger districts, and it requires a level of support for the curriculum, both at the teacher level, the school level, and then probably the director of special education. So it requires several levels of support, and probably one of the biggest obstacles of all. Well, there's 2 obstacles. The biggest obstacle of all is the Common Core state standards. That's pretty much the single biggest obstacle, is that the No Child Left Behind, here's the irony of it, that act left thousands of children behind, especially our children. But it was pretty ineptly named. And many districts feel like they must teach literally what's from the Common Core. So you have children with multiple and severe disabilities in science and history lessons that really probably can't benefit much from that at all, if any. And so getting districts to realize that, no, you don't have to teach exactly what's in the Common Core. You can do what are called extensions or connectors, so you can do some sort of approximations of what's there. That's number 2 is in the area of autism. There's a lot of people that are really intent on teaching developmental skills to children all the way till they're 21. In fact, several different states actually promote that, so that they have 18 and 19-year-old kids with man repertoires of 3 or 4 signs or pictures, and they're still on a developmental curriculum. They're still on an ABLE or a BB map or an Early Start Denver model, a curriculum that would be there for the purpose of trying to catch up with your peers when that expectation is long since passed. And those are the 2 largest obstacles. But of those 2, the biggest obstacle is the Common Core state standards.
Interesting. Have these large entities or small school districts, for that matter, gotten any pushback from the State Department of Ed or the federal one in terms of, I guess, not closely adhering to the Common Core?
Well, that's hard to determine because that's so different, idiosyncratic to the individual people you talk to. In my experience, I don't hear a theme or a trend in any particular direction, except they want things like alternate assessment standards adhered to. They would promote full inclusion inclusion with kids without disabilities most of the school day, if not all of the school day. What started out, certainly some inclusion is not only good, but it's beneficial for many of our kids. But to go to full inclusion, another thing. Most of the problem is not necessarily from federal or state supervision. I don't sense that.
Okay.
Most of it has to do with a basic misunderstanding of what you can do with the Common Core and what you can't. There's a curriculum that became quite popular in special education across the country, the unique learning systems. And it became popular because it was tagged to the Common Core. It's a watered down sort of academic curriculum. And and many districts use it. And what they don't realize is that once you've begun to use that curriculum, you've already accepted Common Core connectors and extensions. And so you could easily use Essential for Living just in the same way you use Unique. So a lot of it has to do with people's lack of knowledge or experience with dealing with this kind of thing. And they're, at least the people above them are insistent on the Common Core. Or there's a couple of states that have their own version of the Common Core. I just spent some time in Texas, and Texas has the TEKS, which is the Texas version of the Common Core. Florida has the access points. That's the Florida version of the Common Core. But they're the same type of a curriculum.
Got it. And when you're going into these large districts, is it a train-the-trainer model? What is the model that you're using to staff these programs with experts in teaching functional life skills?
In the larger districts, it absolutely is train the trainer. Okay. Like in Fairfax, they set aside, I think it was about 18 people. Most of them were behavior analysts or had some behavioral training, and we trained them, and then they fanned out in the district to train the individual teachers.
I see.
In Louisville, which is right outside of Dallas, we trained a group of their teachers, some of whom went right away to work using it, and about 3 of them became teacher trainers, and they fanned out to the district. So it's a bit of both, and the larger the district, the more the train-the-trainer seems to play a role.
I'm going to ask you a question, and it's not meant to be loaded in nature, but it just occurred to me when you're talking about this model, because I remember when I was talking with Greg Hanley about how they do their work with the FTF behavioral consulting. They oftentimes have an easier time doing assessment interventions when the staff are naive to the basics of behavior analysis, and when they do some of these assessment interventions with people with existing behavioral training, some of them are BCBAs, they carry some baggage with them, perhaps from previous training. It sounds like you're training people with probably some bit of a varied background. In Fairfax, you're saying some of them are BCBAs, and perhaps in other districts they might not be. Do you? Is that a characterization that Greg had, or observation that he had, consistent with yours, or what has been your experience in terms of working with people of varied educational backgrounds as it relates to the basic fundamentals of behaviorism?
No, I would agree with Greg. In many instances, we would rather have somebody who's naive, especially if it's a special education teacher who hasn't sort of bought fully into full inclusion. Mm-hmm. If they see their children's education as being neglected with the Common Core, which that's no exaggeration, it is neglected with the Common Core. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And if they see that, then we can just go right in and start going. And they don't. Some of the, they might recognize stimulus equivalence or stimulus control, but they wouldn't know what to call it.
I see.
They wouldn't know how to describe it. So I would say in general, I would agree with Greg that we seem to have better luck. Now, when I got the group together in Fairfax, when I was training them, as just as an example, were there some people who bucked it, who didn't like it, there's some aspects of Essential for Living that are not mainstream. For instance, there's no mention of percent. We don't measure with percent at all, and yet that's very mainstream in behavior analysis. And some people resisted that enormously. Mm-hmm. We're not developmental. We are very much pragmatic, and people resisted that. There are references to the standard acceleration chart. People resisted that. Behavioral people resisted that enormously.
I see.
So there is some of that pushback for sure. And then once in a while, you'll get behavioral people that will have a problem with private events. You know?
Okay.
Well, how would you teach a child to tell you they had a headache? Or they're not feeling well? How would you do that? Mm-hmm. And we show some people how you would begin to try to do that. And so there's some pushback behaviorally. There's also pushback from speech and language people who want to rush in and flood somebody with 300 words with a core vocabulary or something. When a kid has 2 words, they want to give them 300 right away and a great big board.
The core board, the dreaded core board.
The core board, I know. It's just, and then so when you're teaching, when you're training people in a large school district, you get a bit of that, and that's why it takes sort of a couple days to work through that and try to move people a little bit, you know, in the way that you'd like to see them move, and in a sense of being pragmatic and, I mean, not worrying about what language looks like, worry about what it accomplishes for people.
I see. You know, Pat, you are a master of the segue, because without even knowing it, I think you broached the topic that you suggested we chat about today. So we're already on the topic of language. So when you and I were emailing back and forth, you had an idea for an angle for our conversation. So you want to talk about when language delays become a barrier. So what did you mean by that? And so let's get into this topic a little bit. So what made you want to bring this up as a topic?
Well, I've been trying for some time to help people understand what happens when you have a child who's maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years of age, who maybe who was progressing along in, say, the or the VB map, or maybe the early start Denver model, and somewhere along the line the progress starts to slow down. And then in some cases even comes to pretty close to a grinding halt. In the VB map, that tends to happen in the latter part of level 2.
Okay.
And what happens when you see those kids? And when you try various other teaching procedures and you still do not make much of a dent, and in other words, acquire the skills that you would want to acquire at that level of language, you know? And I've been struggling with how to get people to sort of relate to that, and then what you do if you're there, if you find yourself there.
Okay.
And so we wrote a little companion manual that's on our website. It's entitled Deciding What to Teach. And it's so one of my latest, sort of tries at this is when you get to a youngster who's just slowing down enormously in their progress. The way we've been saying it recently is it becomes obvious that the language, there's not a delay in the language, because a delay implies you could get past it and catch up. It's a barrier. It's just something that you just can't figure out how to get around. When you've got a child whose intraverbal repertoire is largely little memorized, quick answers to something, and they're questions they never hear again. Like somebody says, tell me something you're wearing. The answer is sweater. But it's the only answer. They don't know any other answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Or name some farm animals. And the answer is the same every time. Or you run into problems with conditional discriminations or abstract concepts. And despite all of your efforts to teach those things, you just don't make very much progress, maybe over 6 months, a year, or even more. And then I think what you realize is either you need some new teaching procedures, which is always possible, mm-hmm. or what's happening is you're running into a barrier that you just and probably most of the people in our field don't know how to get around.
When you say barrier, Pat, do you mean like the ceiling of the child's ability, or just a barrier from a clinical standpoint? As you say, like maybe we're going about this the wrong way, or we don't have a full grasp on the nature of this particular challenge, this learning challenge.
No, I think it's more the former. But again, we don't know for sure. It's just a guess. It's an estimate. But I think I'll give you an example. Recently, I'll give you an example of when my daughter was here. And I tried to teach her one time what a medium-sized Sprite was, because she usually got a small one at McDonald's. And one time when I was gone on a trip, she got a large one because she was thirsty, and she didn't like the way it made her feel. So I said, well, why don't you try a medium-sized Sprite? And when I first mentioned that to her, she looked at me like I'd said something in another language. And so I took 3 glasses out of the cupboard at home, and I said, see, this is the medium size, this is the small, this is the large. And she looked at me and she said, those aren't the McDonald's cups. And she's screaming really loud, listen, I asked you about the McDonald's cups, don't tell me about this, So I went and I said, okay, well, I said, you see the medium one right there, the glasses on the counter? It's in between the large and the small. Well, thinking that would make it better, it didn't. It made it worse. Because that's metaphor. Mm-hmm. See? But then in order to understand it, we had to go to McDonald's the next day. I showed her the 3 cups. She understood which one was the medium one. And when she went to order on the drive-thru, she was all excited. And she said that she was ordering it on the microphone. And she said, I want my fish sandwich, this. And she knows how to do all of that. And then she said, now remember, she's talking into a microphone. There's not a physical person sitting there. And she says, and today I'm having a medium Sprite. How do you like that? And she was so excited that she knew exactly what that meant. But if I hadn't made it concrete, I think we'd have been there for a long time.
I see. She had to have the direct experience with the McDonald's cups.
I just think we'd have been there a long, long time. And because sometimes when you try to describe you use metaphor, you use analogy, things like that. And for a lot of our kids with limited language, it doesn't go very far. Mm-hmm. And then you've got kids with discrimination issues, or if you had a cup on a table and it was amidst a bunch of other things, and you said, touch the cup, point to the cup. You could teach that with a lot of prompting, and a lot of kids would get that. But then what happens when you say, go get the cup? You see, now you have the joint control issues going on, and can you mediate your own listener response? And a whole lot of kids can't. Well, and then go get the blue cup, the one you used yesterday. Oh, well, come on. Now the levels of discrimination get enormous. And so it is. I'm talking about things that you think, oh boy, there's so much that learner has to have to get to. You need them.
Yeah, with the go get the blue cup, you gotta know what a cup is. You gotta know where it is. You have to understand simple instructions like go get, which may be multiple level instructions depending on how far you have to travel. And the little kicker you put in there, like the one you used yesterday, there's a lot going on in that phrase that we take for granted all the time, right?
Well, and you sit and you watch typical 3-year-old children. They ask and answer why questions with no difficulty at all, none. And you see 8-year-olds that don't have. You can't imagine the circumstance under which you could get a reasonable answer to a why question. Mm-hmm. And you try and you go up to all kinds, and you do all sorts of RFFCs and you do the whole thing, and then you just. So what we think is that just looks like a barrier that right now in this state of our evolution as a species, I don't think we know how to get around some of those things. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure we don't. And I don't think that's necessarily a permanent thing, but it's at least permanent for a while. It's there for a while, and I don't know how to get around some of that stuff. When you can't use metaphor, it has to always be concrete. How do you get intraverbals? How do you get them?
Yeah.
And when you transfer an intraverbal from a tact, you're now talking about something that's not there. Mm. It's not in your environment. And I think for some kids, that's a mountain to climb.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge mountain to climb. And that's why I think we started to call them, we're not saying a kid could never learn that. If you just look at you just say, I just don't see how. So rather than spending the next 3 or 4 years trying to figure out how to get a small outcome, let's divert our attention to things we know they will use, put them in a more concrete situation, and make their life better.
I see. Yeah, so to focus on things that they can do to be more independent and happy.
Yes, and fulfilled, and and that maybe they're not going to sit and answer intraverbals, pure intraverbals, or make pure interverbal responses. Maybe their interverbal responses are going to be multiply controlled. Maybe when you say to them, what would you like on your sandwich? The sandwich is in front of them. The ketchup and mustard are in front of them. They've learned to tack the ketchup and mustard. So their answer is, I'll have ketchup today, but I don't want any mustard, whatever it is. That's the answer. And that's controlled by motivation. It's controlled by the presence of the objects and controlled by the question. But when you do RFFC, TFFC kind of stuff, if I say, tell me something you wear, if you say sweater, that's only controlled by the verbal stimulus, mm-hmm. the prior verbal stimulus. So you're shooting for a pure interverbal up front. And I think for many of our kids, that's a mountain.
Yeah.
It is a mountain. And maybe you could get a little way up the mountain, but relative to the time you have to teach them and what would matter in their life, it's a little bit like, let's say that you have a 16-year-old youngster who has a repertoire of 20 mans, and they're 16 years old, and they've never been taught tacks, right? But somebody wants to teach them how to participate in a conversation. So they're going to teach a few tacks so they can maybe transfer them to interverbals and get some answers to questions, right? Okay. And like, what's mom doing? Oh, mom's doing the laundry, or mom's doing this, or mom's doing that. And you can tack the situations and then transfer to interverbals, that kind of thing. Okay, you do that, you find it very difficult, but you're able to transfer it a little bit to a certain number of circumstances. And let's say it takes you a year to get that. You say, in the year that you spent getting that, which has very limited daily utility, could you have taught 10 more mans? that would have affected the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And that's the point we make. Because
Yeah.
you have taught 10 more mans. And if you taught those tacks, they'll probably only take you to a few intraverbals anyway. And if you're an adult, which deficit gets you in trouble? Is it a deficit in mans or a deficit in intraverbals that gets you into trouble? It's a deficit in mans.
Yeah, for sure.
And listener responding. And so for us, you see, the two repertoires that are the most important for us in language are neither the tact nor the intraverbal. The two that are most important for us are the man and the listener response.
Everyone, I want to tell you about a cool event that's coming up on February 28th, 2020. It's the Insider's Guide to Legal Tactics Used Against Schools, How Behavior Analysis Can Help. This event's brought to you by Brett Denovi and Associates, and it'll take place again on February 28th from 9:30 to 2 p.m. at the Doubletree Hilton Hotel Orlando at SeaWorld. If you don't happen to be in the Orlando area on that day, you can attend via webinar. All the proceeds go to support the B.F. Skinner Foundation. How cool is that? Student discounts are also available. So what I would recommend that you do is just hit the show notes to this episode. Go to behavioralobservations.com, and you can find them from there, and you'll find links to register for that event. Again, it's the Insider's Guide to Legal Tactics Used Against Schools, How Behavior Analysis Can Help, on February 28th, 2020. So that brings me to another point that I want to talk about. I don't think we got to this in our previous conversations, but you have a neat taxonomy of skills in the Essential for Living, and it's like the nice to have, the must have, and I forgot the middle one. Did I get help me out here?
Good to have, nice. Yeah, must have, should have, good to have, nice to have.
Thank you. So what? So the mans and the listener responding would be the must-haves in your opinion.
Some mans would be must-haves, and some listener responses would be must-haves, but not all of them.
I see. Okay.
A must-have for us, a must-have is a skill. If you're physically capable of doing it, you have to be physically capable. You have to be able to have certain movements in your body that allow that, because our curriculum is for kids that some of our kids have very limited movements. But assuming you have the physical capability to do it, assuming that, then the must-haves are things that keep you safe, keep you from being vulnerable, and keep you away from problem behavior. And that's how they become must-haves. If you can't you can't communicate your needs and wants, those are must-haves. If you don't respond as a listener when it involves your safety, if I holler out at you, put the knife down, and you don't pay any attention, that involves your safety. If I say, come here, and you won't come, and you keep running toward the street, that's your safety.
Mm-hmm.
See what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And then you've got daily living skills. If you can't get in a bathtub or you can't get in a shower, your overall health is compromised. And it's that kind of thing. And so when you're vulnerable, when you're not safe, and when problem behavior is right around the corner, then that's what we call the must-have skills. And then there's the ones that are almost that, but not that, all the way down to the nice-to-haves, which are things like tracing your name and distinguishing pink from red, and other kinds of things that are kind of cute and kind of nice, but you could go your whole life and never do that, and it would hardly affect you at all.
I think that would be like a great framework for like IEP development. I could just imagine, like, I think everything is, at least in my travels, is so siloed, if you will, in terms of, these are the recommendations for reading. These are the recommendations for math. These are the recommendations for, social behavioral skills, and then, daily living skills, etc. Reconfiguring that in that framework, I think, would be pretty neat. But anyway, that thanks for stepping us through that, and again, I think that's a great way of looking at any learner in terms of setting priorities, because at the end of the day, there's only so many hours we have to work with our learners, and we have to make some decisions. So that's a good way of kind of framing that up. I want to transition here a little bit and talk a little bit about the Verbal Behavior Conference that's coming up. So I guess my first question relative to this is when did you first start attending the conference? Or well, at least as far as the website's concerned, I think they've listed you as one of the I guess founding fathers, if you will, of the conference. I see you rolling your eyes there, but
that is more than a minor exaggeration. Good grief. I'm not the father of anything, but I appreciate the pleasant thoughts, but no. I learned all of my verbal behavior from Jack Michael, and not all of it, but most of it, and some from Dave Palmer, and some from Vince Carbone, and some from a whole bunch of other people. What I did is I helped to bring verbal behavior to people other than people with autism who had limited repertoires. Mm-hmm. That's where I brought it. When I saw that most of the verbal behavior training was being brought to kids with autism in the context of developmental, I said, what about the rest of the world? And I was coming back on an airplane from London with Vince Carbone, and we'd done a lot of work together. And I told him, I said, it's time for me to go home, because most of my life had been with kids with moderate to severe disabilities of all types. And I didn't see verbal behavior coming to them. So that's my contribution. I'm not the father of anything, but if my contribution is something in terms of application, that's where it is.
I see. Well, with regard to the conference, I think that you've got a talk that kind of speaks to that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you intend to talk about? And we don't want to give it all away because we want to incentivize people to attend. And I should probably pause here and just remind people that the Verbal Behavior Conference is taking place on April 2nd and 3rd in Austin, Texas. And I'll have the details in the show notes for this particular episode. But I've got the conference schedule here pulled up. And your talk, you're speaking at the start of day 2, and it's for our learners with limited repertoires, a call for a lifetime of pragmatic language.
Yeah, it pretty much is what it says. Pragmatics in the sense that speech and language pathologists use the term. Pragmatics is essentially a subdivision of their coursework that has to do with how language is used and what language accomplishes. And it doesn't so much emphasize its form as we would say it emphasizes its function. It emphasizes what it accomplishes for the learner, what happens as a result of that language. And it minimizes the efforts or minimizes the emphasis on form. And where that happens is if you have a child with 6 pictures that they communicate with, or 10 signs, or whatever it is, or maybe even spoken words, but you only have 4 or 5 or 6. At that point in time, pragmatics is more important to you. Sentence structure is not important to you as the speaker, you see? And that's why in the picture exchange program, where you get 4 or 5 pictures and all of a sudden you get the I want sentence strip, that's misplaced. You don't need to form a sentence when you only have 4 or 5 words. I mean, you wouldn't do that with a typically developing child at home. I mean, you wouldn't say, geez, honey, he's got 4 words, time for a sentence. Nobody would do that. It would seem so ridiculous because it isn't useful. You need grammar and syntax when you have hundreds of words. And then you put them together into the structure that is beneficial for all the rest of us. And so pragmatics is, let's teach people stuff that makes a difference for them. And if let's say I had a child who was signing, and let's say they had their first couple of signs, and one of their signs is juice. And they maybe have cracker, and they have a sign for chair, which is their favorite rocking chair they like to sit in, see? And maybe the other one is go outside, meaning go out to play outside. So they got 4 signs, you see? And so you're going to add now you're going to see if you could put 2 signs together. Well, what a lot of people would do is they'd say, drink juice. Well, what point would there be in that? It doesn't add anything. I mean, if the person is doing anything with the juice besides drinking it, you probably wouldn't want to encourage them to ask for it anyway. Right. If they just like to pour it all over the heads of other kids, I actually had a little girl one time that did that. She'd ask for juice and find the nearest kid and pour it over his head. And it was kind of cute to watch it, but that's probably not a very good man to be teaching. So you don't need drink. You need juice cookies, something that would go together, or juice orange, you see? And right. that's pragmatic. And then you gradually increase what people can say. And then when they can say lots of stuff that they want and need to say, then you can add the grammar, you can add the formal structure to it. But when you try to do it early, you're taking up, you're putting things in their length of utterance that they don't need or want to say either one. You know, and that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about in terms of pragmatics.
All right, cool. I look forward to. I'm going to be at the conference. I'm really excited to attend, and I have the task of herding cats because the night before I'm going to be moderating the panel with I think you and five other presenters. So that should be fun. I think I might get one question out in the hour, maybe 2, but it's going to be fun.
Yeah, it might be a little tough to get that group to stop talking. Yes, I would imagine it. Yeah.
But it'll be the easiest interview I've ever conducted.
Hopefully, nobody will have had a glass of wine before the session.
All right, yeah,
that would make it worse.
I see. All right, very good. So let's talk about so you've been to the conference before. More generally, what makes this conference different or special from your perspective? Because I know you are out and about a lot and you get to go to a lot of events. So what makes the Verbal Behavior Conference unique?
Well, I think it has, because it has, in terms of language, it has something for everybody. I mean, it has, this time around, we have people who are extraordinary researchers in the field of verbal behavior. Then we have somebody like Dr. Dave Palmer, who's not only an extraordinary researcher, he's a conceptual guy par excellence. You've had him on, you know.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was struggling to keep up, but I was fascinated at the same time. So
go. You know, most people can't go, but he gets you thinking about things that you might not have thought of otherwise. And then you have some excellent researchers, and then you have Mark Sundberg and I, who, although Mark has done some nice research, Mark is every bit as much a practitioner as he is a researcher. And me, I've spent most of my life as a practitioner. And so you get a wide variety of people. And you get Barb Esch, and she's done a lot of wonderful work. She's brought her whole background in speech and language into, verbal behavior analysis. And then you have others who are, really terrific researchers. So there's a lot you could draw from it.
Great. Well, I look forward to attending, and I'm looking forward to checking it out for the first time. I'm looking forward to going to Austin, Texas. Never been to Austin before, so very, very excited about that.
Well, it's wonderful. Austin is a wonderful town. I was just there a week ago.
Oh boy, yeah. So, all right, cool. So I'm gonna close here with a question submitted by none other than Dr. Merrill Winston.
Oh, yeah.
And when he heard that I was going to have you back on, He gave me a couple of suggestions of things to ask you, and I selected this one. He said, ask him about Ogden Lindsley playing with pencils. And he didn't give any context. So I'm just going to leave it there, and you can kind of take that in any direction you wish.
Well, I know exactly where that is. And I used that story countless numbers of times. Ogden used to get irritated when people were trying to do preference assessments because they'd have little clipboards and pencils and they'd be checking off things, they'd be looking and making notes. And he drew a little bit of an analogy from the old song Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie.
Oh, yeah.
And in the middle of the song, Arlo Guthrie is talking about his experience at the draft board. And he said they were sitting over on the Group W bench. Then they were playing, they were filling out the forms and playing with the pencils. That's a famous line from that song. Now, the younger generation doesn't know that song, but that's for old guys like me. But anyway, and Ogden knew that song very well. And he would say, he said, remember Alice's Restaurant, put your pencils down and watch the learner. Because when you got your pencil, you're writing, you're looking away from the learner. And they wouldn't notice things like the child. How do you know that the child loves the sunlight? Because the child's head drooped over in their wheelchair just so that the top of their head could be in the sunlight. And the person didn't notice it. He said, that's a preference right there. So you didn't notice that. Why? Put your pencil down and you would have noticed that. Put your pencil down.
Got it.
You can write that stuff later. Put your pencil down and watch. Because there was such little, and these were severely impaired kids looking for preferences. Well, he doesn't like anything. Well, that's because you haven't looked. Look, you'll find it. And that's the old story with Ogden with put the pencils down.
All right.
That's where all it comes from.
Well, I always like getting Og stories from you, and I think that's a great place to
well, he gave us a lot of them.
Yeah. So, all right. So we'll have to keep some of those in reserve for future visits to the show, Pat. So, but thanks again for joining me today and I should add too, you're very gracious coming on in such short notice, but we wanted to get this episode out so we can let people know about the cool stuff going on at the Verbal Behavior Conference. And yeah, so.
You don't mind my saying so. You keep up the good work. You're doing a phenomenal job. And we all love your work.
Thank you. That means a lot. I appreciate it. And I am as I like to say, I'm the luckiest guy in the behavior in the field of behavior analysis because I get to pick the brains of all these interesting folks. So it's inherently reinforcing. Let me just say that. But thank you. All right, Pat. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.